This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. I saw this article come up the other day, and it's been sort of on the back of my mind for a little bit. It was in Guitar magazine, I think, or it might have been Guitar. Yeah, Guitar. And in an interview with guitarist, basically, so Steve Lukather, who you've heard of, right, says there's no magic guitar, no magic amp, there's just magic people. And going further than that, he says, I played Eddie Van Halen's guitars, Jeff Beck's guitars, and I sound like me. A great guitar and a great amp. Sure, that helps, how could it not? But if you give a 1959 Les Paul to a 10-year-old kid that can't play, it's not going to make him sound like Gary Moore, you know what I mean? Not necessarily particularly contentious. The question that was asked of him to raise that was, would you rather buy a really good guitar and a budget guitar amp, or a cheap guitar and a high-end amp? I have my thoughts on that. So first of all, I would say, basically these days, I think an amp isn't really even necessary if you're touring the world, right? We've seen people like Guthrie, people like John Mayer. We've got, you know, countless examples now, Dave Murray from Iron Maiden, of people that have no amp on stage. Of course, quite a lot of the younger generation, you boys like Tim Henson and that sort of stuff. I think they do use some backline maybe actually, but Jack Gardner, Pliny, a load of these kind of players don't use amps at all. So I think money spent on a guitar these days is probably better, especially if, like me, you do quite a lot of playing at home, or especially if you're like me where you play with function bands where you use in-ear monitors a lot of the time anyway. So a great amp for me is non-essential. A great guitar is a nice thing. So then Rob Chapman, who you've heard of, hugely respect Steve, but I disagree. I've played thousands of guitars in my demonstration career, and from that 1 in a million Yamaha all the way through to the Beast or Eric Clapton's Blackie, I've been surprised by how particular guitars can allow us special access to creative freedom. He added, of course it comes down to much more than just the gear, and I guess that's what he's getting at, but gear really does make a big difference, and I suppose it's important to remember that he's saying this while playing a $3,000 guitar and $3,000 amplifier. That's kind of the point though, isn't it? So I've heard Joe Bonamassa say relatively similar things, like no matter what he plugs into, he ends up sounding like him. He just moves the knobs until they sound like what he wants to sound like. Of course, again, with Joe Bonamassa, it's a thing where he's either using sort of incredibly rare Dumbles or incredibly old Tweed amps, right, a lot of the times. I also had another experience this week where someone asked me, so Chris, we were in Project Music, Chris Elphick, and Project Music is now about the only music shop in Exeter, because Manson's went by the wayside, Music Room went by the wayside. So basically Project Music is the only place left now, which is a bit of a shame, but They stock some great guitars in there, and he asked me in there, you know, of what are your top 3 amps and what are your top 3 guitars. And honestly, I've had a lot of amps recently, or since lockdown, and I've obviously got through a lot of guitars. I did a video not so long ago about my entire sort of guitar collection, and my top 1 guitar is this. So this is the K-Line, and you know about this if you've seen the stuff on the channel. Now, I don't think this is a Magic guitar, but it is kind of magic to me. I got this for about £850 off a forum, before a few more people knew about K-Line guitars and realised that they were really quite nice guitars. So this is my number 1. I've played a couple of 60s Strats now, a 1970 Strat. I think this holds its own with them, and for me, this is kind of the guitar that I gravitate towards, speaks to me most. But I didn't have a good other 2 answers for Chris. I think maybe Jake's Murphy Lab might be another second choice, like the second best guitar that I've played. But I guess for me, that kind of says it. Like there could be one Magic guitar in your life, or a couple of Magic guitars, but probably once you've played a few, you start to realize, you know, once a guitar is set up nicely, that's mostly what I'm looking for. You know, if you can play the guitar and feel like you can play it how you want to, like that Strat, then it's no longer a barrier. But I think there is a price thing where you're more likely to get that if you spend a little bit more money. But certainly I played Fender custom shops that don't really speak to me. I played 2 American vintage, 2 60s Strats in Project Music the other day, and I wasn't blown away by those. Jake's got a custom shop Strat, which is really, really nice. I've played Tony's Eric Johnson Strat, and that's amazing for the money as well. And I think, so you basically just have to play a few of those probably. As for, then he asked me like my top 3 amps, and I don't know if I really have them. So I've got my Mesa Boogie Nomad 45, which by no means is a special or Magic amp at all, but it does a bunch of things that I like, and it's stayed here whilst, you know, other things have come through the house. California Tweeds, a bunch of Mesa Boogie Mark amps, and Orange Rockaverb, a Mesa Boogie Road King, Blue Angel, countless things, a 2-Rock Jet, Carol Ann Tucana. You know, it's seen off a load of stuff, partly because of sentimental value, and I think that's another thing that we need to bear in mind with kind of when we think of like a Magic rig or a Magic guitar is normally tied to a person or a couple of people, right? When you talk about Greenie, that guitar by itself is not special. It's the fact that it belonged to Peter Green, Gary Moore, now Kirk Hammett. There's a story in that. It's not, the guitar itself is not the special thing, right? It's even got headstock break and stuff, I guess. So I think I'm more on Steve Lukather's side on this, to be honest. I know it's a common thing to sort of dunk on Rob Chapman. That's not really what I'm doing, but it's a thing that I hear lots of people say that have had experience of playing lots of gear, that eventually it sort of all melds more or less into one, and you start to realise that, well, I kind of sound like me on most of these things anyway, especially when I then put them all through an HX Stomp. And that to me is my favourite piece of gear. You know, it wouldn't be an amp that I would choose. It'd be my K-Line Strat and probably an HX Stomp or a Helix or something like that. So right, I wouldn't even necessarily pick one amp because most of the time I'm plugging into that. And I think Steve Lukather is one of those guys that has been able to get great tones out of lots of stuff that he's plugged into. So yeah, what are your thoughts? Are there Magic fingers? Are there Magic pieces of gear for you? I think there are Magic combinations of gear, and Andy Timmons is a guy that made me think about some of these things, like humble pieces of gear like the Blues Driver, which actually can do some pretty magical things. I think there are definitely combinations that work really well. You look at someone like Eric Johnson, John Mayer, some of these people. And another thing that made me think about this, Philip Sace going from an incredibly vintage Strat to a PRS Silver Sky, presumably roughly off the shelf, Still sounds exactly like Philip says. Still sounds amazing. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Catch you in another video.